Have you ever wondered how the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, one of the most enduring and controversial of modern times, began? Let's journey back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a time when the world was changing rapidly and the seeds of this conflict were being sown. Back then, two significant national movements were gaining momentum. On one hand, we had Zionism, a Jewish nationalist movement with a vision of establishing a homeland for Jews in what was then Palestine, an area under the control of the Ottoman Empire. This yearning for a homeland was fueled by centuries of persecution and a longing to return to their ancestral land. On the other hand, Arab nationalism was also on the rise. Arabs, who formed the majority of the population in Palestine, began to nurture a shared sense of identity and a desire for independence from Ottoman rule. The same land that the Zionists viewed as their promised homeland was seen by the Palestinian Arabs as rightfully theirs, a land where they had been living for centuries. In the midst of these rising national movements, in November of 1917, came a turning point: the Balfour Declaration. This was a public statement issued by the British government during World War I, announcing support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. The declaration was ambiguous, promising to uphold the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, which were predominantly Arab. However, the vagueness of this promise only fueled the tension. The implications of the Balfour Declaration were profound. It didn't just support the aspirations of the Zionists, but it also introduced a new player into the mix: the British. Their role as a colonial power and their conflicting promises to both the Jews and the Arabs further complicated the situation. So the seeds of conflict were sown early in the 20th century, setting the stage for what was to come. The stage was set, the actors in place, and the curtain was about to rise on a conflict that would shape the course of history in the Middle East. Now, imagine the world after World War I. The British took control of Palestine, but how did this impact the brewing conflict? The Mandatory Palestine Era, stretching from 1920 to 1948, was a pivotal period in the history of this enduring conflict. The British, under the auspices of a League of Nations mandate, administered Palestine, and this control was not without its repercussions. This was a time of increased Jewish immigration, driven largely by the rise of Nazi persecution in Europe. The Jews, seeking refuge from the horrors unfolding in their homelands, saw Palestine as a beacon of hope, a place to start anew. The British government, which had previously expressed support for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine through the Balfour Declaration of 1917, facilitated this influx. However, this surge in Jewish immigration did not go unnoticed by the Arab communities in Palestine. They had been living there for generations, and the sudden influx of immigrants was a source of tension. The Arab communities felt threatened by the demographic shift, fearing the loss of their land and political power. These fears were not unfounded, as the British often favored Jewish immigrants in disputes over land and resources. The friction between the Jewish and Arab communities was further exacerbated by divergent nationalist aspirations. The Jews aspired to establish a Jewish state in Palestine, while the Arabs yearned for self-rule and independence. These conflicting desires, coupled with the British administration's often inconsistent policies, fueled a cycle of protests, riots, and violence that periodically engulfed the region. By the end of World War II, the tensions had reached a boiling point. The world had been shocked by the horrific revelations of the Holocaust, which further increased global sympathy for the Jewish plight. Many now saw the need for a Jewish state as an urgent humanitarian issue. However, the question of how to reconcile this with the rights and aspirations of the Arab population in Palestine remained unanswered. With the end of World War II and the horror of the Holocaust, the world was about to witness a significant shift in the region. 1948, a year of joy for some, a year of catastrophe for others. Can you guess why? This pivotal year marked a significant turning point in the history of the Middle East. After decades of tension and conflict, the United Nations proposed a partition plan, aiming to divide the British-controlled Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states. Jerusalem, considered sacred by both Jews and Arabs, was to be under international administration. On May 14, 1948, the Jewish leadership, led by David Ben-Gurion, declared the establishment of the State of Israel, marking the birth of a new nation. But this moment of joy for the Jewish people sparked immediate conflict. Even as the ink dried on the declaration, neighboring Arab states, refusing to accept the UN partition plan, launched a military intervention. This was the beginning of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, a brutal conflict that would last for nearly 10 months. The war was marked by fierce battles, strategic maneuvers, and a profound human cost. It was a time of uncertainty and upheaval, as the newly formed Israel fought to assert its existence and the Arab states sought to challenge it. Meanwhile, for the Palestinian Arabs, this period became known as the Nakba, or catastrophe. As the war unfolded, an estimated 700,000 Palestinians were displaced from their homes, creating a refugee crisis that persists to this day. The 1948 war ended with an armistice in 1949, but not without leaving a lasting impact on the region. Israel emerged with more territory than initially proposed by the UN, including Western Jerusalem. The remaining territories of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip came under the control of Jordan and Egypt respectively, leaving the Palestinian Arabs with significantly less territory than originally proposed in the UN partition plan. The 1948 war ended, leaving Israel with more territory than initially proposed by the UN, and the Palestinian Arabs with less. This chapter in history set the stage for the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict, a struggle marked by deep-seated political, religious, and cultural divisions. Fast forward to 1967, a war that lasted just 6 days, but its effects still reverberate today. This war, known as the Six-Day War, was a pivotal moment in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It started on June 5, when Israel launched a preemptive strike against Egypt, following escalating tensions and threats from neighboring Arab countries. In the span of less than a week, Israel managed to seize control of several territories. Among these were the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, areas densely populated by Palestinians. Israel also took control of the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt and the Golan Heights from Syria. This occupation significantly expanded Israel's territorial footprint and set the stage for a new phase in the conflict. In the aftermath of the Six-Day War, we see the emergence of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO. The PLO was not a new entity. It had been established in 1964. However, post-Six-Day War, it gained prominence and became more active. The organization, led by Yasser Arafat, aimed to create an independent state for Palestinians and was willing to use both political and military means to achieve this goal. The PLO's rise to prominence signaled a shift in the conflict. The struggle for Palestinian statehood was no longer solely against Israel, but also against international powers that recognized and supported Israel. The situation was further complicated by the fact that the territories seized by Israel during the Six-Day War were now under Israeli law, which meant that they were effectively part of Israel, despite international condemnation and the protests of the Palestinians living there. In the years following the Six-Day War, the conflict continued to escalate, with multiple wars and uprisings. The Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories became a significant point of contention, fueling resentment and sparking a push for Palestinian statehood that continues to this day. The map of the Middle East was redrawn again, and the quest for a Palestinian state became more complicated. As the 20th century drew to a close, two significant uprisings and a peace process took center stage. But did they bring peace? The first Intifada, or uprising, erupted in late 1987, born out of deep-seated frustration among the Palestinians living under Israeli occupation. It was a largely grassroots movement characterized by strikes, boycotts, and civil disobedience. In response, Israel employed heavy-handed tactics, further deepening the divide between the two sides. Then, in 1993, hope for peace seemed to glimmer on the horizon. The Oslo Accords, brokered by the United States, marked the first time that Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization formally recognized each other. The accords laid out a framework for self-governance in parts of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and for further negotiations on a final status agreement. Yet, this beacon of hope was tragically extinguished with the assassination of Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in 1995. The man who had dared to shake hands with PLO chairman Yasser Arafat on the White House lawn was killed by a Jewish extremist who opposed the peace process. The second Intifada broke out in 2000, more violent and deadly than its predecessor. The hope that had been kindled by the Oslo Accords seemed to vanish in a whirlwind of suicide bombings and military reprisals. Meanwhile, Israeli settlements in the West Bank continued to expand. These settlements, deemed illegal by the international community, threw a wrench into the peace process. They not only ate into the land that was supposed to form a future Palestinian state, but also created facts on the ground that made a two-state solution increasingly unattainable. The dawn of the 21st century saw no resolution to the conflict, leaving many to question, can there ever be peace in the Middle East?